Welcome, everyone, to another Historical Materialism broadcast. My name is Alexander Stoffel. I'm an editorial board member with the Journal. And for today's event, we are joined by Nick Nesbitt and Nathan Brown to discuss Nick's most recent book, Reading Capital's Materialist Dialectic. Welcome, everyone, to another Historical Materialism broadcast. That's okay. Marx, Spinoza, and the Althusserians. Nick is a professor of French at Princeton University, and Nathan is a professor of English at Concordia University. And the way that this is going to work is we'll first have a short presentation of the book from Nick, and that'll be followed by a conversation about the book between Nick and Nathan. For those of you who are watching live on YouTube, if you do have any questions, we'd welcome you to post them in the YouTube chat because we'll have time towards the end to answer your questions during the Q&A. And that's already all from me. Nick, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Alex. I want to thank you. I want to thank HM in general for inviting me to come and talk a little bit about the book, but especially Nathan. I'm so grateful that you accepted to come and discuss. And already, we know. I guess it's not on the cover itself, but on the webpage. Your blurb is there on the book. Your thinking and reading of the book itself pushed me already in many important ways to try to improve it, and it's better for that. And so let me just say a little bit about the book. I'll try to keep it short, and so we can get quickly to your own current thoughts, Nathan, and the discussion, which is I'm really looking forward to. So first, let me just show people the beautiful cover on the new Haymarket paper version that David Mabb has produced. I love his recent covers in general. This one, I was really blown away by it. I don't know how he came up with it, but I love the way, for me, it sort of visually and economically presents one of the basic ideas of the book, which is, so we could just say, Badiou's idea of a multiplicity of untotalized worlds and their logics coexisting in an open fashion. And anyway, I'm really happy with that. And also, I'd say Haymarket is having a 40% sale this summer on all of the HM series, and so this book included. And so let me quickly just run through a few of the basic arguments and claims and propositions that I put forward in the book. And so I sort of begin axiomatically. I begin from a basic starting point and claim that we live in capitalism. All right. Some Mackenzie Wark, for example, have claimed recently that, or Jody Dean, I think, is making another version of that claim, that we're in some other social logic currently. And I disagree. Probably many, most people watching may also disagree with that and agree that we are in still the social logic of capitalism. And furthermore, that Marx, in the very first sentence of Capital Volume 1, offers an axiomatic starting point for a minimal definition of capitalism as the general accumulation of commodities in a given social world. And then from there deduces step by step at a very high level of abstraction that increasingly gets more and more concrete, the necessary implications of that axiomatic starting point. The money form, the nature of surplus value and its source, et cetera, the necessity of accumulation, all these sorts of things that follow from that starting point, which is an axiomatic one, I'm arguing, rather than one uh, derived from certain guarantees, right? Whatever those might be. And then it's also a book that defends the Althusserian idea of theoretical practice, right? As something that in the 70s was very much contested as one form of practice. That is, that there are practices in the plural, as Althusser says, rather than theory and practice, but theoretical practice is one among many, a multiplicity of forms of practice. And the idea, it follows very much the book's argument follows very much the French idea of epistemologie, right? Distinct from the English Anglophone concept of epistemology and theory in German, that is, theories of knowledge based on consciousness, but rather this French tradition starting from Descartes and Spinoza through all of these very important 20th century figures, Cavaillés, Guaret, and Althusser and Badiou, so many others who discuss the knowledge based on the construction of ideas rather than an empiricist based model of knowledge. And so as I proceeded in that fashion, in the book, I had to construct a new object of knowledge, sort of in the same way that Althusser claims of Marx. That is, this idea of an Althusserian reading of Capital is sort of, it's a bricolage that I put together from many different sources. So the primary reference, of course, is Reading Capital. It's a book that goes back to Reading Capital and defends in the strongest terms I could muster let's say the correctness of many of the positions, the epistemological positions taken there. But it also brings together many other resources and thinkers. It's not just about Althusser himself. And in fact, Althusser is important in the first chapter, but really it's drawing even more strongly on Pierre Macherey's work. The whole second chapter is dedicated to Macherey, but really the whole book is drawing on Macherey's thought very strongly, and then Badiou is important, especially in the last two chapters. But the basic idea, why did I have to construct a novel object of knowledge there, is because after May 68, simply this group of Althusserian thinkers abandoned the project of reading Capital, right? May 68 marked this sort of watershed moment where they went in different directions. Think of Badiou's Red Years writings of the 70s, or Rancière's attack on Althusser. Macherey then went off on his own paths, particularly Hegel or Spinoza, and then the magnificent 5-volume exposition of Spinoza's ethics. And yet my basic claim, and then Badiou, who never talks about Marx and Marx's Capital in any of his works, and yet one of the claims that I'm putting forward is that nonetheless these Althusserian thinkers continued to work on the basic problems of what I call a positive materialist dialectic, as opposed to a negative Hegelian contradiction-based dialectic. They continued to work on that project, but not directed at an exposition and an analysis and synthetic presentation of Marx's method of exposition, as they had, Althusser especially, but Macherey also very strongly had argued in Reading Capital. They never really pursued that. Macherey was going to write a dissertation in 67. He was going to start a dissertation on Marx's Capital that presumably would have developed his very short chapter in reading Capital in those directions. With May 68, he dropped that project and went in other directions. But I'm arguing that all of these thinkers nonetheless pursued this project of articulating a positive materialist dialectic based on Spinozist a Spinozist epistemology in particular, but without explicit reference to capital itself any longer after 68. The last time that happens is in when Balibar and Macherey drive down to Cerisy in 67 for the centenary of the publication of Capital, and they sort of storm the Cerisy proceedings and show up one day. This is as Balibar told the story to me. They just sort of stormed in and gave their Althusserian spiel, and then there's a really interesting discussion. The proceedings you can get through the Cerisy publications, and then left. But anyway, that was 67, and then after that, the problem of this positive materialist dialectic addresses different objects. Spinoza, for example, with Macherey, or Badiou articulating his own philosophy. And nonetheless, I try to remain faithful to this basic proposition that Althusser puts forward in reading Capital, that Marx's Capital develops its own singular, sui generis, apodictic form of demonstration that is specifically not a Hegelian one. And Althusser puts forward that famous claim, which hasn't gotten a lot of take up since reading Capital. I think there are many reasons why not, but one of them is that he just simply doesn't back it up. He sort of puts it out there, as he did with many other propositions, and then goes on to other arguments and other ideas. I tried to follow that through and show that, in fact, he was correct. And that's what I try to do, especially in my third chapter. The first chapter discusses Althusser, reading Capital, theoretical practice, these kinds of problems. The second chapter is really a celebration and defense of Pierre Macherey's thought and his development, not just in his readings of Spinoza, but in his own writings, of his own ideas of a materialist dialectic. And it's also a celebration of his untranslated 5-volume exposition of Spinoza's ethics, which is incredible. And when I wrote that chapter, the second volume was out of print, but it's since appeared in a reprint by Proof. This is volume 2 of the 5. And I think anybody interested in this stuff should run out and get this. It's an amazing discussion, exposition, analysis of volume 2 of the Ethics, which is the volume, the chapter of the Ethics, or the book, talking about the issues that I was concerned with. And then the third chapter, trying to go quickly here. The third chapter for me is really where I accomplish something. I mean, the book puts forward a lot of propositions and claims, but for me, I'm happy. I think I really did something in chapter 3, because I try to actually, as I said a minute ago, I try to actually demonstrate, looking through the development of Marx's writings, the different drafts and editions of Capital Volume 1, especially the first chapter and also the first 7 chapters of Capital. And chapter 12, I'll get to in a second, is also really important in its rewritings. Anyway, what I try to show is that if we read very closely through the Mega 2 editions that we have now available to us as scholars, what we see is that, in fact, Althusser was right, and that Hegelian, let's call them negative dialectical modes of demonstration, determinations of reflection, etc., these sorts of things are predominant, but gradually are eliminated through especially the second 1872 edition of Volume 1, the German 1872, and above all, the French 1872 to 1875 edition. And in those two, what we see is a clear tendency, not a total elimination, but a clear tendency, as Althusser always said, to an epistemological break, a tendency to replace Hegelian modes of demonstration, negative dialectical modes, with a positive synthetic dialectic, simply dialectic, not in its Hegelian sense, but in the general sense of the term, adequate demonstration of whatever type. And we see that happening step by step, systematically, not just at the level of the replacement of a word like Widerspruch, contradiction, by and I'm forgetting the word that replaces it, by well, it'll come to me in a second. Confrontation, I forget the word that he uses in chapter 1. Anyway, not by simply a nominal replacement of Hegelian terms, but by an actual transformation in the mode of demonstration from a negative dialectical one to a positive synthetic one. There's a critique in that chapter also of the predominant notion of totality that is so commonly deployed in many readings of Marx's readings of Capital to the present. I think Macherey in particular has very strong and compelling arguments against the necessity of a notion of totality and the problem as a sort of guarantee for thought, as opposed to a more adequate axiomatic orientation and starting point for thought. And yeah, and then finally, Spinoza and Marx in that third chapter, I think I show that Spinoza was actually much more important for Marx than has ever, to my knowledge, at least been admitted or recognized. If we look specifically at the epistemological dimension, at Marx's mode of demonstration, and my case in point for my argument is chapter 12 of Capital One, that nobody much looks at or pays much attention to. It's very short, but if we look at the French edition in particular, we see something. You know, if you've read the Penguin edition, readers will be familiar with this formula that shows up in chapter 12. But in fact, that formula only is plugged in by Marx in the French edition. It's not even in the 1872 German edition. And for me, I try to make a big case from that as exemplary of this tendency away from a Hegelian mode of demonstration toward what we could call Spinozist, or simply a positive mode of demonstration, that culminates in what this formula, which doesn't add any content to the chapter, but it formalizes it in a very powerful and I think interesting systematic way, and I think Spinozist way, as a perfect example of what Spinoza calls common notions, right? And I think it's really, really interesting to me at present. Maybe I'll close on this note. From all of this, I'm now starting to do some work on Lacan and reading Capital after Lacan, not what Lacan takes himself from Marx, but what we as readers of Capital can take from Lacan, the ideas of the matem, the mathematizable, at the limits of the real, etc. And there, Badiou's seminar on Lacan is really, really interesting beyond the 2 or 3 pages that I talk about in my fourth chapter in the book. Anyway, the point simply being that this formula that Marx plugs into chapter 12 in the Penguin edition, it's chapter 12, is a sort of a matem, as is even more so MCM prime at the end of chapter 5, I guess, leading into chapter 6, right? Hic erodus hic salta. Right. And so that process of formalization that Marx increasingly develops, exemplified by the addition of this formula in chapter 12, I think, I hope, is the culmination of my demonstration, my attempt to demonstrate in the most adequate way I could muster that Althusser was right, even though he maybe didn't even know fully why he was right. He certainly never got around to demonstrating in any substantial sense that he was right. But nonetheless, I hope to have showed that he was right, that in fact Marx tendentially abandons a Hegelian negative dialectical mode of demonstration in his revisions of Capital and develops a new sui generis positive materialist dialectic without contradiction. Anyway, so those are a few of the ideas in there. There's plenty more to talk about, but I'm going to stop right there so that I can enjoy hearing a little bit of Nathan's thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nick. And as you said, it's also for me a pleasure to engage in this conversation. You and I started talking and debating some of these things around the publication of my book, Rationalist Empiricism, in which I was thinking through many of the same issues emerging from this French epistemological tradition. And so I want to say, to begin with, in my remarks, why I admire this book so much, and then I'll move to some questions that I have about it. And just to frame that, I'll just say, all of these questions that you're dealing with, the relationship of Marx to Spinoza, the relationship of rationalism and empiricism in the French epistemology of science, the sort of intervention of the circle around Althusser and Althusser himself from the early 60s until after May 68. These are all things that I've really racked my brain about over the years, and that I know are extremely complex, even hermetic to some degree. And and for that reason, I appreciate the tremendous amount of work that you've done, both at the level of research and argumentation. There's a lot of archival material in this book, which I think is very important, and it's also a grand synthesis of a lot of different material from those traditions. And I think at the heart of it is this very, very difficult question of the relationship of Marx to Spinoza, which I want to take up. But I'll say a few more things about why I think the book is important. So for one thing, I mean, there are elements of, as you know, elements of your argument about the Spinoza-Marx relation that I disagree with in the book, and that we can talk about in a moment. But that's precisely why I think this book is so important. That in order to have a capacious understanding of, not only the import of Marx's critique of political economy and the relationship between theory and practice as it bears itself out historically, as it contributes to the sort of the theory and the history of communism, but also to work through Marx as a thinker, I think we need the strongest possible account of many of the different divergent positions on Marx's thought. So let's say I find your account of an anti-Hegelian Marx very illuminating, as I do. I might also find the strongest version of a Hegelian reading of Marx extremely illuminating. So for me, that's not to be to promote a kind of eclecticism, but rather I think that in order for us to arrive at our own positions, and to be able to rigorously think through them and the problems and the complexities that they entail, we have to work through the strongest version, of other positions or positions close to but divergent from our own. And so this is why I think this book is important. I think it is, as you said in your opening remarks, the most sort of in-depth defense of a Spinozist reading of Marx that would derive from Althusserian circles that I have encountered. Anyway, and so I appreciate it in that respect because, as you say, Althusser himself often makes these references which are not really worked out, and it's very hard to know how to locate them, how they interact with other problems in his corpus, etc. And I think you really have tried to, let's say, construct, the implications of some of those remarks. And then the other thing that I particularly appreciate about that element of the project is the way that you've done so through Macherey, who for me as well is a tremendously important thinker. And even though, I think people know how important Hegel or Marx is, hopefully people are beginning to think about how important Macherey's theory of literary production is. For Marxists, this is an absolutely essential book because it's anyone who's read it knows how thoroughly it contributes to Jameson's The Political Unconscious. It is in many ways, I would say, the sort of backbone of that book, sort of maybe amusingly along with Northrop Frye. And so Macherey is tremendously influential in ways that maybe sometimes are in the background. And then for me, what I appreciate is the way that you've sort of reconstructed the import of Macherey's 5-volume introduction to Spinoza. And all of that, I think, is very important work. I also think, as you said, that this third chapter on Marx's positive dialectic. Now, this is something that, I myself am more inclined, I'm more sympathetic to Hegelian aspects of Marx's method, but I find this also, I really do agree, in fact, and I find myself compelled by the demonstration that you've offered, because I think it's true that, if one reads The Science of Logic in particular, and then one reads, Volume 1 of Capital in particular, you can see very clearly that, let's say, the movement of reflection that one finds in Hegel, where the engine, of dialectical thinking and eventually of what he will call recollection, Erinnerung, that it derives from this very processual movement of thought through negation, the negation of the negation, of course. And this is not just the thought of one subject. And here, maybe I would carve out a position that I think that I would defend a little bit against some elements of your book. That if we're thinking about a philosophy of consciousness and a philosophy of the concept in Cavailles's sense, that in Hegel I would position Hegel on the side of a philosophy of the concept versus, let's say, a philosophy of consciousness in Kant, because for Hegel that movement of thought is not the thought of an individual; it's the movement of thought itself. And that thought subtends the thinking of any empirical individual. And that thought is auto-negating. It's a movement of what Hegel would call immanent critique rather than transcendental critique. But nevertheless, it is a movement where you have to follow the thing through in a stepwise manner. And of course, and that's the way the thinking works. It's not just a question of how it's presented, but a question of how the thinking operates. That is, it is sequential. And although of course, there are many sequential elements, obviously, as there are with any book, to Marx's mode of presentation. I agree that it is closer to the mode of presentation in Spinoza, where we have what I might call a sort of concatenated production of concepts, where we're not necessarily overcoming a previous stage of reflection, but rather assembling a sort of constellation of concepts that mutually and systematically support one another. And that would be the criterion for what Marx calls Wissenschaft, science. And here I agree with you and would absolutely defend the distinction between science and ideology that Althusser insists on as it bears upon Marx. Why? Because science is not something which is determined once and for all and which is unrevisable. On the contrary, Wissenschaft, systematic knowledge, is that which establishes a relationship, a systematic relationship among concepts, such that it can criticize itself in a way which is coherent and which doesn't destroy the very foundation of that theory, but rather allows one to modify it from within its parameters. That's what I think is meant by science, and also the import of Althusser always insisting, but particularly in the lecture course for scientists, on the fact that science is not something which is established once and for all, and which is forever shorn of ideology and distinguishes itself from it. Rather, just as Althusser and his collaborators do in reading Capital, it's a system of concepts which is capable of criticizing its own ideological residues, which remain internal to it, and which constantly, forever, have to be criticized and worked through. Science is that which is capable of criticizing those ideological elements which remain within it. And Althusser's theory of the three generalities is a theory of how that works. So all of that, anyway, this construction of Marx's positive dialectic, I urge everyone to read, because it's even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool Hegelian, because it's a very, very important articulation of this way of thinking about Marx's project. And finally, I also admire and appreciate your sort of relentless defense of Althusser against his own self-criticism, against his own sort of auto-accusations of theoreticism, and your commitment to what you called a sort of high period of Althusserian theory in the mid-60s. And that also I more or less agree with, although I certainly am myself, and in my book, very critical of certain aspects of Althusser's, let's say, politics, that I do think are well and truly exposed by May 68. But I also agree that his sort of overcompensation for that exposure leads to certain types of theoretical regression in his own work. Okay, so all of that being said, I then want to pose some questions basically about the relationship between Marx and Spinoza, and that you draw from Althusser and Macherey, and I want to raise these critical questions at the level of both ontology and epistemology. So as you may remember, in the chapter of rationalist empiricism that I wrote on Althusser and Théorie communiste, I basically argue that there's a problem epistemologically with thinking about structural causality in terms of substance. And I think you've addressed one element of this question that Macherey himself brings up in letters to Althusser, which is a critique of substance monism. That substance ought not to be conceived as one, that substance is uncountable, etc. And I think, again, this is something very important that you draw from and reconstruct from Macherey's commentary on Spinozism, and I appreciate that very much. However, I think a problem remains with, let's say, not necessarily the application, but with conceptualizing capitalism and conceptualizing the structural causality of capitalism through the Spinozist concept of substance, and that's what I want to try to lay out. So first of all, in your own book, this is a central part, I think, of your Spinozist approach to Marx. On page 52, you call for, along with Macherey, a materialist reformulation of Spinoza's substance as structural causality. So that's a major part of the project. On page 59, you note that Macherey articulates a rigorous materialist understanding of Spinoza's substance as uncounted causality. So that's part of your critique of substance monism. So here it's uncounted causality. It's a form, let's say, of structural causality, which is not necessarily to be understood as one. Although we might think about it as a totality in a more complex sense, but an uncountable totality, let's say. And finally, in your very interesting remarks on Mosley's reading of Marx, which is very important also to what you're doing, you note that that one might think of surplus value in Mosley's account. Okay, so you insist on you take seriously his argument that that any individual capital has to be conceived as an aliquot part of the total surplus value of capitalism, understood, let's say, as a system of structural causality. And on that basis, that sort of that level of abstraction for thinking about surplus value, you argue that surplus value forms what you call the general substance of capital. So now we have a concept of that sort of total surplus value at any moment in the system, understanding that that's always changing, so there really is no empirical moment. But that is conceived as the substance of capital. And we want an understanding of Spinoza's substance as uncounted causality, and that will give us what you call a materialist reformulation of Spinoza's substance as structural causality. So that's the way that this is handled in the book. And for me, I think this is where I part ways. For me, this doesn't work because of fundamental things in the conceptualization of substance in Spinoza's system, which I take to be absolutely essential to his epistemology. So first of all, just to lay these out, Book 1, Proposition 7, Spinoza notes that it belongs to the nature of substance to exist. So it belongs to the nature of substance to exist. That is to say, existence is necessary to substance, and this is integral to its concept. Book 1, Proposition 8, every substance is necessarily infinite. So those two together have important consequences, which then Spinoza explicates in the second scholium to Book 1, Proposition 8. He argues that since it belongs to the nature of substance to exist, right, that's Proposition 7, the definition of substance must involve necessary existence. So the definition of substance has to involve necessary existence. That is to say, that which is substance necessarily exists. Also, that substance is not something which is created, right? We cannot conceive of substance as something that comes into being or comes into existence and passes out of existence. And finally, substance cannot be restricted, this is in the same scholium, in its existence. Well, no, this would be me extrapolating from that scholium. So we could say then substance cannot be restricted in its existence to any particular historical epoch, for example. So this would be to grant that it's finite, that it's contingent, and that it's temporal, right? Rather than understanding it, as Spinoza argues, that we must, as infinite, as necessary, and as eternal. All of this is crucial because, it's the whole basis of his critique of Descartes' substance dualism. And along those lines, right, so then this is Book 1, Proposition 14, because of these consequences, that it's of the nature of substance to exist, that every substance is necessarily infinite, from the implications of these arguments, Spinoza will draw the proposition, no substance can be conceived besides God. And this, I think, is something that really one can't compromise with in Spinoza's system. So we can say God or nature. But even if we don't understand substance as one, it's not a case of substance monism. No substance can be conceived besides God. And that's because of the necessary existence of substance. It's because substance is necessarily infinite. It's because it has to be understood as not coming into and passing out of being. And then in Book 1, Proposition 21, Spinoza says, everything that follows from the absolute nature of any of God's attributes must have existed forever and be infinite, as they are eternal and infinite through that attribute. So anything that pertains to the attributes of substance, God, the only substance that can be conceived, must have existed forever and be infinite. Okay, so those are the propositions from Book 1 that are crucial to constructing the concept of substance. And in my view, these are incompatible with the existence of a historically specific mode of production understood as capitalism. So along those lines, let me say a little bit about the epistemological consequences and then look at a passage in Marx, although nothing really hinges upon any particular passage in Marx, but I do think it's helpful to see what he thinks about these matters. So again, when Spinoza thinks about the third kind of knowledge, on which you take to be essential to understanding capital in a sort of Marxist sense, he speaks of, right, so knowing, cognizing under the aspect of eternity. In the scholium to Book 5, Proposition 29, we conceive things as actual in two ways. Either insofar as we conceive them to exist in relation to a certain time and place, or insofar as we conceive them to be contained in God and follow from the necessity of the divine nature. So that would be to conceive them adequately, to conceive them according to the third kind of knowledge. And so here I just want to quote from Marx in the afterword to the second edition in German. And this is an interesting passage because it's where he actually uses this. He characterizes the positive and the critical aspects of his dialectical method. You probably know the passage very well. So he's speaking about Hegel, and he says, the dialectical method in its mystified form became fashionable in Germany because it seemed to transfigure that which exists. But in its rational form, it annoys and even horrifies the members of the German bourgeoisie and their doctrinaire spokespeople because, and here he says, the positive dialectical understanding of that which exists simultaneously implies an understanding of its negation or its necessary demise. Now, this is an important point. Its demise is necessary. So it is contingent, but it's necessary that we think its contingency. Let's put it that way, its demise. So this positive aspect of the dialectic simultaneously implies an understanding of its negation or necessary demise. And he says, the dialectical method grasps every developed form in the flow of its movement and thus grasps its transient side too. The method is not impressed by anything else for that matter. Its essence is critical and revolutionary. And so in your book, the way that I think you handle this sort of question is to say, okay, when we conceive of the phenomenal forms of capital's existence, we may do so, let's say, under the first form of knowledge in Spinoza, according to the illusions of the imagination or the imaginary. And therefore, we need to construct scientific knowledge of it, and we need to be able to think it under the aspect of eternity, according to the third kind of knowledge. But in my view, in trying to think through how Marx is a Spinozist, I myself have tried to understand, and what I cannot overcome in my own attempt to reconstruct, this Spinozist epistemology in Marx, is these definitions of substance, which then inhibit this epistemological approach, which is that what is conceived of substance has to be conceived as necessarily existing, as necessarily infinite, as neither coming into being nor passing away, and that no substance can be conceived besides God. And I think that for Marx himself, this would be why he would hesitate, to conceive of substance as structural causality. Because indeed, to understand the structural causality of capital, we have to be able to abstract from the immediacy of empirical givenness. But we can't understand capital itself as something that necessarily exists, and that cannot come into being or pass away. And so in my view, then, the scientific basis of let's say, Wissenschaft in Marx, the scientificity of Marx's understanding belongs to the second kind of knowledge in Spinoza, a knowledge which is systematic, which is rational, which involves a sort of relational, imminence of concepts toward the construction of other concepts, which I think you give an amazing analysis of. And I would sort of like take what for me are the very incredible contributions of your book, and I would reconstruct them that way. That's how I sort of think about what I can do with its contribution. But I would back away from, let's say, a conceptualization of structural causality as substance. So I wonder what you think of that attempt at a sort of critique.
Nathan, thanks. It's super helpful and clear and right on target. I think that it helps me a lot already in your earlier comments to me about the book. I have to say, you put forth a similar, I think, case to me, and I have to say that as I was rewriting the manuscript that is now the book, I probably did a totally inadequate job in addressing that question. That reminds me actually of the way that Althusser addressed Macherey's critiques to him, which is simply to like cross out the offending references and just get on with it. And so that doesn't hold. And what you've put forward here, how to get around this. I think you're okay. Substance is not equal to structural causality. I agree with you. I'm convinced by your argument. And so, I would have to maybe write another book or at least another chapter to really address that in an adequate way. But in an inadequate way, I would just start by saying that part of the problem is just that substance is such a slippery word. And obviously, as you say, we're talking at two different levels. We're talking about ontology and epistemology. And this is a book about epistemology. And so in that sense, whenever I bring in ontological claims like that, I don't really do the work and to back them up. And in particular, you've identified this one that doesn't really hold water. But substance, nonetheless, for example, you mentioned in passing, I make this claim: surplus value is the substance of capitalism in its functioning, simply as its common element, the lifeblood, the necessity, the production, the valorization of value, the production of surplus value and its accumulation. That, Marx shows, is the necessary lifeblood as a common element or substance of the capitalist social form, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not that's more of an epistemological claim than an ontological one. It's just using the word substance as a common element. But as you say, taking from Fred Mosley's arguments, I very much think that that's the case. But simply, Marx demonstrates that, as you say, his starting point isn't, as is Spinoza's, isn't an ontological one of substance as such. However, we're going to understand it, as you say, as necessarily infinite, necessarily implying its existence as eternal, as God or nature, etc. Marx starts with a historical object, an actually existing historical object, right? As he says in the notes on Wagner, right? That I don't derive surplus value out of a logic, out of a concept. I take an actually existing social form, and through my preceding analysis, the Grundrisse, etc., I have determined what is the necessary starting point. And with that historical object, I've figured out that my necessary starting point to understand the whole thing, right, is value and the commodity specifically as its self form, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a historical but logical starting point, right? It's not. So this is where I want to I want to hear more from you. It's not an empirical starting point, right? And this is where your book pushed me and my thinking very, very far and very hard, and where I'm still not completely. We maybe we're approaching the question of empiricism and rationalism and from different angles, different sides. So I want to get back to that with you. But my understanding is that Marx begins from this theoretical, highly abstract starting point of a commodity abstracted from all sorts of empirical, actually existing aspects like owners of commodities, money, et cetera, that he only gradually adds back in. So it's a theoretical object, not an empirical object that he starts from. Nonetheless, it's materialist. Nonetheless, it's starting from an actually existing social form, capitalism. And oh, and then last thing maybe I would say quickly is that all of this, nonetheless, I try to make as much as I can out of not just Macherey's discussion, really important discussion of Proposition 7 in Book 2 about the so-called, wrongly called parallelism of thought and extension, but also 8 and 9 that are very rarely talked about, and was so illuminating his discussion of actually existing things and non-existent things, which is to say primarily ideas as they in their adequacy as ideas of the essential nature of any singular thing. 2:8 and 2:9, and Macherey points to the key aspect of temporality for Spinoza in that distinction between ideas as non-existent singular things and existing things. Temporality is Macherey points to as one of the key things that distinguishes those. And so then finally, I would say that I love going back to this little example of this formula Marx drops in. This for me is not just a common notion. I think you're right about capital really as tending toward the development of these sorts of common notions, Spinoza's second mode of knowledge. But I would also say that a formula like that is eternal. It is in its adequacy. It's not just a common idea, but insofar as it is adequate, it is a bit of eternity that tells us outside of any temporally existing singular thing like market relations or GDP in global capitalism today, here and now or then. That formula, like others that Marx comes up with, that formula tells us about the eternal nature of surplus value in this case of its rate and mass, right? And so that formula is an example both of, I would say, a common notion and also of the eternal, essential, could we say, substantial nature, insofar as any aspect of substance in the ontological sense is of the essence as a formula such as this is. But so that's what I would say. But maybe, as I know time is running short, maybe we can get back to the problem of empiricism and rationalism, because this to me is so interesting, and I want to hear a little more from you about how your ideas about empiricism differ from what I'm trying to argue here, because I know we don't completely agree on this. Am I right?
Yes, but I think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think I agree with you a little bit more than you agree with me. Maybe I'm trying to say why. Like, I mean, first of all, I think that was helpful. And again, what I think is most important about thinking about Marx in a Spinozist way is that Spinozism pushes us, you know, toward the sort of adequate levels of abstraction and conceptual interrelationship that you're emphasizing here. And so while I would modify the framework of thinking from the concept of substance toward epistemological adequacy, I still think it's very important, actually, and what you say I'm sympathetic to, that this diagram, that this math theme, that there's something eternal about it in the sense that, while the object which it theorizes is historical, it seizes, grasps, the essence, that is to say, the adequate cause of that historical phenomenon in a way which is true. And that criterion of truth is extremely important. And I think that when people are sort of light about that, when Marxists, back away, when they shy away from that sort of epistemological criterion, I think there's something about it which is in bad faith, right? That is to say, we do think that Marx's analysis of capital is correct. That doesn't mean there's nothing incorrect in it, but it does establish through a formula like that something that we need in order to grasp the nature of capital. And how does it do that? It's capable of doing that because of the whole history of political economy in modernity, which, for example, through the labor theory of value, which is modified by Marx, constructs the condition of possibility for rectifying, for a critique of political economy. In order for that to happen, a lot of mistakes have to have been made, and also we can go back now to Marx himself, and we can update the way that he thinks about, for example, the movement of the history of subsumption after historical periods of capitalism that he could have anticipated, although he anticipates a great deal, precisely through his own theory. So I do think that it's that kind of approach to theoretical knowledge that Spinoza pushes us toward. And in that sense, broadly speaking, I am indeed a Spinozist, and always have been. Um, and particularly why? Because the distinction between the first kind of knowledge and both the second and the third kind of knowledge is absolutely crucial. And both the second and the third kind of knowledge for Spinoza can be adequate knowledge, he emphasizes. So we may vary on points of emphasis and points of conceptual determination vis-a-vis substance, but there's a lot in your account that I accept and learn from. About rationalism and empiricism. Well, you know, I am not as allergic, let's say, or to put it more seriously, I'm not as opposed to any element of empirical knowledge bearing upon and mattering to the systematic construction of conceptual knowledge. That is to say, I think it's very important, first of all, what you emphasize, that we cannot set out from the position of a vulgar empiricism, which just accepts the phenomena, adduces them, and says, here's a historical account. That kind of historicism is obviously not what Marx is doing, as he emphasizes again and again and again. It's a power of abstraction, which renders him superior to, let's say, the methods of normal economic history, and also to the analytic capacities of the political economists. And that can only be understood through an ability to, let's say, formalize, as you emphasize, and to rationally construct a system of concepts which pushes our thinking of the capitalist mode of production to a very high level of abstraction, which in many ways is hard to grasp. That is to say, it goes beyond any common sense about what value is, about many things, about social reproduction also under capitalism, and about the class relation under capitalism. So, and about the history of capitalism. But nevertheless, for me, it's very important also to take very seriously the empirical elements of capital. And that doesn't mean that he's like doing experiments or something. What he's doing is, reading in the British Library. But he's reading facts, he's reading a lot and he's including a lot of facts. And the question is, why does that matter? It matters in the one sense because he can then take those up and reconstruct them according to his, systematic rational understanding of the concepts crucial to understanding the history of capitalism. For example, the whole theory of basically the Industrial Revolution, or the beginning and the progress of real subsumption, and of the division of labor as what he calls a Scheidungsprozess. In order to understand that, one has to understand it through the technical concepts that he's developed. You can't just understand it by giving an empirical account of it. But in order for us to be able to revise, science is by right revisable, and in order for us to be able to revise, we have to then think through also from practice, from the history of practices and through economic history. So for example, Robert Brenner's work is extremely important to me because of course, it's an empirical account of the history of post-World War II capital up to the present day. And it's one which could only be achieved through a synthesis of Marx's rationalist understanding, but it's also one that gives us tremendous resources from an empirical perspective to understand Marx's own theory from the perspective of, the contemporary, let's say, the recent history of capital. So for me, there is a dialectic of the rational and the empirical, where we can see, for example, that in the history of science, it's possible for, the formalisms that were in crisis in physics in the 19th century. It's empirical phenomena popping up, which are inconsistent with those formalisms, which then require reformalizations like Einstein's or like quantum theory, which then become the basis of further experimentation, which can then also modify. In this way, I think that Koyré is proximate to that kind of understanding. There's a relationship between the rational and the empirical where they have to, Bachelard thinks, mutually negate one another, and maybe you disagree with that. But in the book, so just to wrap up, like you position Cavea very strongly against Bachelard, and you refer to Bachelard's experimentalist empiricism. But I just think that's only one side of what Bachelard is doing. Most people, of course, understand Bachelard's epistemological writings as a kind of overbearing rationalism. It's from Bachelard that we get the theory of the epistemological break. And what I think is important is to understand the way that Bachelard gives us an approach to the relationship between experimental practice and rational theory, where each of them can correct and modify the other. And I would say I agree with you that there's a sense in which the rational has to take priority, because the very ground of science is a construction of conceptual relationships which is systematic, and you can't see anything empirically without that. But we know that new instruments in the sciences can be very important. They're the ground of the Copernican revolution, and that continues to be the case today, even in the way that we modify our standards of measurement, that we redefine units of measurement. We need new experimental procedures in order to combine that with the formalizations that we have. So all of that's very important to me in the theory of science and important in the theory of Marxist science as well. I'm not at all, I am all for a very strong critique of empiricism, but what I mean by rationalist empiricism is a way of folding into, the development of the phenomena that we have to trace through experiment and through political practice, and through observation and political reports, with scientific theory at a rational level.
Thanks. If I can just say one last word, or then Nathan, you can wrap it up. I think we agree on a lot, on so much here, and I wanted just to go back to one thing you said toward the beginning about the book putting together an extreme argument, and I'm very happy to hear you say that. I guess at least in that aspect, I remain an Adornian at heart, right, or Benjaminian. I don't know. The truth is in the extremes, and to hear you say that makes me happy, because it makes me feel that I've put forward the most extreme Althusserian anti-empiricist argument that I could possibly muster, seeing this historical epistemology tradition, not just from Spinoza, but really from Descartes. If from the sort of clearing gesture and skepticism over the senses and the empirical, the anti-Baconian position, and but of course, with Descartes, then we have to guarantee it all with the proof of God. So instead, we make the leap to Spinoza and an axiomatic undertaking. Also, Brenner and Wood. I totally agree. I mean, I try to start the book with let's say, a rendering eternal in the Spinoza sense of the historical argument that Brenner and Wood put forward, that it's not just about the transition to capitalism, commodification of food and shelter, etc., but that is part of the eternal nature of how capitalism renders its subjects subject to the demands of valorization, etc. So we completely agree there. There's just so much more we could say. I know time is short, but I really want to thank you for these comments and your probing ideas that have really pushed me so far in thinking about this and rewriting the book and today, and just your work in general that I take so much from.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Likewise, I mean, I think the book is a major and a permanent contribution to the literature, because these are very important questions, and yeah, I think you've handled them in an extremely serious way. So now I'll go into moderator mode, and I think that Alex has already invited questions from the YouTube feed, and I think we're already seeing one, which seems to be for me. Then maybe I can respond to that briefly, but I'll just invite as many questions as possible now from the audience. All of you who are watching the feed, don't be shy. Feel free to take this opportunity to pose questions at any level at which you're reflecting on these matters, whether you've taken a look at the book or not. It doesn't matter. I'll just read out this question that's been posed right now. Is Nathan saying that due to the transient process of causality bringing about capital, that can't be viewed as a model of substance due to the inherent eternal nature of substance? I mean, yes, that's what I'm saying. To put it more specifically, because in Spinoza, it's crucial that substance is that which cannot come into being, cannot pass out of being, and that is demanded by the sort of criterion of its necessary existence, the fact of its existence being inherent to its very concept. These are the reasons why only God can be understood as substance. No other substance than God can be understood to exist, God or nature. Those are the reasons why I think framing the understanding of capitalism and its structural causality within those conceptual terms doesn't quite work for me. But on the other hand, I will just say that this eternal nature of something, I think that what Nick is trying to get at, enforcing as he does, and I appreciate what he said about, liking the fact that wanting to have presented a sort of extreme version of the argument is very productive, because it forces us to take seriously and not just say, oh, we're talking about the historical rather than the eternal. That's something that we see in Badiou in particular requires a lot of pressure. And so we want to think through that as carefully as possible. And if we say something is true, if we say that a formula is correct, we really have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? Is it just correct right now? Or is that something which is always correct about this historical development and causality of capitalism? So again, I appreciate this about the argument. I think that's an epistemological problem, which is very important. So that would be how I would respond to that question. But do people have other questions for Nick? We can wait. Nick, maybe when we're waiting, I can pose another question just for you.
Mhm.
Because I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the role of Badiou in the book. I
Mhm.
think this is a particularly difficult and interesting aspect of the book, and the way that you're deploying logique des mondes, logics of world, in the book is very complicated, and maybe this would be an opportunity for you to expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I didn't much talk about that. I already gestured toward it in talking about the reading capital as beginning axiomatically rather than based on any guarantees or foundations or totality, etc. And so the third chapter about Badiou, one of the things that it's trying to do is to focus in on Badiou's discussion of the axiomatic and it's something that comes out very clearly, for example, in his lectures on Descartes that I'm reading at the moment, where he, on the one hand, he contrasts the necessity of the guarantee of God. Spinoza just jettisons that guarantee in a very Althusserian gesture. Let's not worry about the guarantees. Let's begin. Well, we have to determine in a materialist way the right starting point, value, the commodity, etc. But we simply begin from there and see where that takes us necessarily axiomatically. But then in the final chapter on logics of worlds, I'm just trying to read Badiou against the grain or in a symptomatic way, let's just say, which is to say that he in all of his many books, he never reads capital far as I know, and I've read many of them. He never reads capital. Nonetheless, I try to develop a coherent argument that there's a sort of palimpsest of a logic of capital going on. He talks in what for me is my probably my favorite, or at least my reference book from him, Logics of Worlds. He talks about all these many different worlds, except for what he himself says is our world, capitalism. And yet he mentions it offhand once or twice in 700 pages. I try to show that the logic of the abstract eternal logic of any and all worlds that he develops in that book, Logics of Worlds, uh, 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 adheres to and develops and brings many determinations to the logic of the capitalist social form that Marx himself articulates in Capital. So I'm trying to read Badiou against the grain. And then I should say also that the afterword also to thank you for pushing me also to put in an afterword, as readers of manuscript often do. I didn't know where to go. You said, what about theory and practice? And so I appended something brief and inadequate about theory and practice to it, pushed by you, but where I offer a little bit of a critique of some of Badiou's reflections on his Maoism, etc. But the real thing that comes to mind is something that I didn't say there, which is that if we choose to think about an actually existing historical object like capitalism, or things that I'm interested in, and you as well, Nathan, slavery, etc., at such a high level of theoretical abstraction as we're addressing here, and as Marx does in Capital. One of the things that I think we need to do is look and make some sense of the anomalies. Like for me, slavery is a capitalist slavery is a case in point. If surplus value is the lifeblood of capitalism, and if by definition slavery does not produce surplus value as Marx defines it, and I think that's absolutely the case, what is it doing for capitalism? Same thing with reproductive labor. If, as non-wage labor, it's not producing by definition surplus value, what is it doing for capitalism, right? And so those for me are really difficult, really interesting questions to try to think through at the level of, not just at a historical level, not just at a phenomenological lived experience level, but also at this very high level of abstraction that Marx thinks at. What about these kinds of anomalies? How do we make sense of them? And so I think that's an important issue in theory and practice today that I didn't think of when I wrote the afterword, but now more and more I'm realizing that that's something really important. Not just thinking about the case itself, the capitalist social form, but what about the things that at first glance don't seem to make sense within that, or like slavery or social reproduction. You're muted.
Thanks. I think that's an element of that revisability of science, which is so important, that accounts like that can be added to the theoretical grounding already established, and that's a crucial work of historical theoretical labor, and also in relation to political labor. So that's the next question that we have here, which will maybe allow you to continue along the same lines. Can you say more about what you think are the political upshots of reorienting Marxism around Spinoza?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a difficult question, and I keep getting it from many quarters. As I say, this book I wrote just before it on capitalist slavery that I was sort of alluding to there. I'm trying I'm addressing this very high level of abstraction that Marx is working at, and trying to think it through in these, let's call them Spinozist aspects and tendencies that Althusser, Macherey, Badiou are working at. And I think one of the things that working at that level allows us to do is simply fundamental, which is to say, maybe it's also linked to this anti-empiricism that we share, as you articulated it, which is to say that when we look, for example, at a historical phenomenon, when we look at the library, at the archive, when we sit down in our whatever our archive or library is, like Marx did in the British Library, in order to make sense of what we see empirically on the page before us, we need to have theoretical reference points, a theoretical language, a theoretical way of making sense of this data. And so for me, for example, in Slavery and Colonialism and Capitalist Slavery, I've tried to think about this political historical problem, bringing to bear a theoretical apparatus, this one that we've been discussing for the last hour, on archival, we could say empirical data, as you were alluding to, that for me, that theory is a pre-existing theory such as that can allow us to make sense of new objects that we find in the archives, as you're saying, that otherwise would simply be, as Macherey says of Spinoza, a sort of swarming empirical mass that is so complex and so unfathomable that we don't know how to make heads or tails of it. We need the theory to make sense of the data of the empirical.
We have another question. I was interested if you could say something about where you place the concept of contradiction in Marx's work, because in the self-criticism essays, Althusser says it's the only concept which Hegel has and perhaps Spinoza does not. So
Yeah.
Could you say more about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, simply just I can point to Macherey's Hegel or Spinoza, where he develops Althusser's point, and he says it's not that there's no concept of contradiction in Spinoza, but rather Spinoza puts contradiction in its place, which is that of existing phenomena, of existence, whereas within an adequate logical demonstration, there is no contradiction. And in the place in my book, then, especially in the third chapter, contradiction, Hegelian Widerspruch, is one of the keys there in my argument. So I remembered the term I was forgetting. Marx replaces contradiction with the term opposition systematically in the first chapter of Capital One, and that has I think I argue vast, strong, compelling theoretical implications, which is to say that of course contradiction is a key, maybe the key Hegelian notion of a Hegelian negative dialectical movement of demonstration, whereas Marx says and he shows this is something that Michael Heinrich, who I think is also an Althusserian, now he's sort of starting to admit that, shows very clearly that Marx builds his argument in this additive way, that he shows simply that if we define axiomatically capitalism as general commodification, then as he gets to each step, it's not that there is a sublation of one concept into another, but rather that one simply shows itself to be correct but inadequate. That is to say, insufficient to account for this axiomatic definition of the general exchange and accumulation of commodities, etc. And so opposition, then there was another piece that fell in my lap, let's say, very late in the manuscript, which is that I was pointed to by a really interesting HM article that I referenced, and I've forgotten the title and the author at this moment, but it's in there in chapter 3. Who the author points back to Marx's discussion of contradiction and opposition already in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, way back in 1841, and he starts out wanting to defend Hegelian logic in his argument with this other German logician, but instead he comes around to his Trendelenburg, I think is his name, to his point of view, and he explicitly posits opposition as the proper logical category rather than Hegelian idealist contradiction. And so I argue that, well, that remains operative even though unidentified and unflagged when in the drafts to Capital he replaces a logic of contradiction with a logic of opposition. So maybe stop there.
That's great. And now the questions are coming in. I guess we have about 5 more minutes. So here's another question specifically about Althusserian epistemology. the person says, sorry if this is not on the book's topic. It very much is on the book's topic. They say, I'd like to know more about the relation between the object of knowledge and the real object, and the relation with a movement from the abstract to the concrete. And then they follow up. I'm asking because I've heard several people saying that there's no movement from the abstract to the concrete in Althusser, just from a lesser to a more developed form of scientific abstraction.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly right, and I agree with that, and I think it is the correct reading of the 3+ extent volumes and reconstructions of Capital that we have, which is to say that Marx says that he moves from a high level of abstraction to increasing concretion, but that what that means, concretion doesn't mean tactility, like concrete in the sense of sensory, moving from the logical to the sensuous. But rather concrete simply as the concretion of multiple elements, multiple aspects together, where the commodity starts at its simplest and most abstract, and gradually Marx folds back in additional categories to our understanding of the commodity exchange, production of surplus value, etc., as they become necessary at each step of the always logical demonstration through, and that holds not just in the first chapter of Capital, but through the whole argument, all the way to the end of volume 3, where it just simply stops, and so that the argument remains from beginning to end a logical one, but where that logic becomes less abstract and more concrete in the sense of more complex, not more sensuous.
Yeah, I could also add something to that, bearing specifically upon Althusser, which is that, Althusser gives us this theory of three so-called generalities, which is sometimes kind of complicated, but at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. Generality 1, it's like existing facts, sort of empirical phenomena. Generality 2, an existing body of scientific knowledge and concepts. Generality 3, the production of new concepts that can modify that existing body of scientific concepts. And he insists on something very important, which is that we're never just presented with raw phenomena. We always approach them with an existing body of knowledge in mind, right? We never have access to the immediacy of givenness. We always come through it with the constructions of what we know, even if we're children. And what science does is then we begin with generality 2, and we work upon generality 1, upon the phenomena with the concepts, and out of that relation we produce new concepts which can then inform generality 2. So this is that movement, of existing scientific theory rectifying what is wrong within it through its work on the phenomena, and then correcting itself. So there's one final question, I guess, that we have time for. The question is, Nick says Capital begins with an axiom that's both immediate but also the result of Marx's inquiry. Is the empirical selection of the axiom mediated by more general theoretical presuppositions?
Oh, for sure. Great question. Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely mediated by more general theoretical presuppositions. So my it's both immediate and the result of an inquiry. So the inquiry is just, we think of Grundrisse, for example, where he ends up realizing he needs to start with value 600 or 700 pages into it, and then he starts immediately from the first sentence of Capital, not in the sense of just plucking something out of nowhere as a pure immediacy, but axiomatically as this is what he has determined is the proper starting point for his demonstration. And so it's immediate in that sense that it's free of guarantees. It's axiomatic in the sense that he says to his reader, if readers, we can all agree that the most basic, immediate form of capitalism is as an immense accumulation of commodities, as general commodification of all things of value. Then what follows from that, right? So it's immediate in that sense, but it's very carefully chosen over hundreds of and a decade plus of research into finding what is the proper starting point, and that will allow him to unfold this whole demonstration in its necessary adequacy. Maybe I just leave it at that.
Okay, well, that's perfect because it is in fact 1:30. So I guess that's all the time we have. I have the old HM, the old Brill version of it, but now that we have this beautiful new Haymarket version, which is affordable, which is on sale, I will end by encouraging everyone to get a copy of this very important book if you are interested in French epistemology of science, Althusser, Macherey, the sort of the epistemology of the critique of political economy, I think is a very important contribution. So thank you so much, Nick, and thanks to Alex and the other organizers for putting this event together.
Thanks so much, Nathan. I appreciate and learn so much every time we talk.
Likewise.
Thanks for the exchange.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye-bye.